As she sang with all her passion and determination to save her ailing son, her voice rose like a silent prayer, filling the night with magic. Suddenly, a car pulled over to listen to the song, marking the beginning of an unexpected encounter that would change their lives forever. The first time Margaret Maggie Peterson heard the crying, she thought it was just the wind. October. In the quiet suburb of Fairview, Texas had a way of playing tricks on the senses, whistling through the weathered wood of her old Victorian home, mimicking human sounds just enough to make a person question their sanity. But when it came again, clearer this time, Maggie knew it wasn't the wind at all. She set down the silver picture frame she'd been polishing and moved to the window, squinting through the early morning light at the house next door. The crying seemed to come from the small backyard that adjoined her prized rose garden. Maggie grabbed her gardening shears as an excuse and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. "Hello?" Her gentle voice cut through the quiet neighborhood sounds. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, shuffling sound. Maggie moved towards her fence line and caught a glimpse of movement, two small figures darting behind the large oak tree that straddled their properties. "I'm not going to hurt you," she called, gentler now. "Are you lost?" Slowly, two identical faces emerged from behind the tree, twin girls no older than 6 with dark hair and large, expressive eyes. Their matching dresses were slightly wrinkled, and they held hands with a grip that spoke of shared fear. "Our new daddy doesn't like us," one of them whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustle of falling leaves. Maggie felt a cold that had nothing to do with the October air. She'd been living in this house for 40 years, the last 15 alone after her husband's passing, and she knew a cry for help when she heard one. "Where's your mother?" she asked, carefully keeping her voice steady. The twins exchanged looks, a silent communication passing between them. The one who hadn't spoken yet, Maggie couldn't tell them apart, pointed toward their house. "Sleeping. Rick doesn't let her play with us anymore." Maggie knelt to the girls' level, noting their solemn expressions and the way they trembled. Whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. "What are your names?" "I'm Camilla," said the first girl who had spoken. "I'm Sophia," said her sister, voice nearly identical. "I'm Maggie," she said, placing a gentle hand on the fence between them. "Would you like to come see my roses?" As she was about to unlatch the gate, a man's voice boomed from the neighboring house. "Girls, get back here right now!" The twins' faces drained of color. Without another word, they turned and ran back, toward their house, where a tall, muscular man stood on the back porch, his face tight with anger. When he spotted Maggie, his expression immediately transformed into a charming smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry if they were bothering." "You, ma'am, they're still learning boundaries." "No bother at all," Maggie called back, forcing a smile of her own. "They're lovely children." Rick Dawson nodded curtly, then turned and ushered the girls inside with a firm hand on each of their small shoulders. The door shut with a definitive click, leaving Maggie alone with her roses and a growing sense of unease. She remembered the young woman, Isabel Ramirez, who had moved in next door just a week ago with her twin daughters. Isabel had seemed exhausted, but had smiled warmly when Maggie brought over a welcome cake. It was Rick who had intercepted the gesture, taking the cake with terse thanks before closing the door, preventing any real conversation. Maggie hadn't seen much of Isabel since. That night, as Maggie prepared for bed, she heard a crash from next door, followed by muffled shouting. She froze, hairbrush in hand, listening. A woman's voice, Isabel's, she presumed, rose briefly before being cut off. Then silence, more terrifying than the noise had been. Maggie's hand trembled as she set down her brush. Her late husband, a police officer for 30 years, had always said that domestic disturbances were the most dangerous calls to respond to. "People are never more unpredictable than when their home life is falling apart," he'd told her. She moved to her bedroom window, which faced the side of the neighbor's house. A light was on in what she guessed was the master bedroom, shadows moving across the drawn curtains. For a moment, Maggie thought she saw the silhouette of someone slumped against a wall. Then the light went out. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind replaying the twins' words. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." The weight of that simple statement pressed on her consciousness, demanding action she wasn't sure she had the courage to take. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, the kind of perfect fall, day that usually brought Maggie joy. Today, however, she moved through her morning routine with distracted efficiency, her attention constantly drawn to the silent house next door. Around 10, she was pruning her roses, positioning herself to have a clear view of the neighbor's backyard, when the back door opened. Isabel stepped out holding a laundry basket. Even from a distance, Maggie could see the dark circles under her eyes and the careful way she moved as if sore. "Good morning," Maggie called, waving her garden shears. Isabel looked up, startled, then glanced quickly back at the house before offering a tight smile. "Good morning, beautiful roses." "Thank you." Maggie moved closer to the fence. "I've been growing them for decades. Would you like some cuttings for your yard? I could show you how to plant them." Something like longing flashed across Isabel's face. "That would be nice, but I don't think—" The back door opened again and Rick appeared. Though he smiled at Maggie, there was a territorial set to his shoulders as he approached Isabel. "Hey, there, neighbor," he said to Maggie, placing an arm around Isabel's waist. "What are you ladies chatting about?" "I was just offering Isabel some rose cuttings," Maggie said, keeping her tone light. "My garden produces more than I can handle these days." Rick's smile didn't waver. "That's real neighborly, but we've got plans to tear out this whole backyard in spring, going with artificial turf, less maintenance." He squeezed Isabel's waist, a gesture that might have seemed affectionate if not for the way she stiffened. "Isn't that right, honey?" Isabel nodded, eyes downcast. "Yes, we discussed it." "Where are the girls today?" Maggie asked, deliberately changing the subject. "Inside, doing their lessons," Rick answered before Isabel could speak. "I homeschool them. Public education's a joke these days." "How wonderful that you're so involved," Maggie said, studying his face. "They seem like bright children." Something flickered behind Rick's eyes, annoyance perhaps, or suspicion. "They're smart enough. Need discipline, though." He checked his watch with exaggerated care. "Speaking of which, we should get back inside. Come on, Isabel." As they turned to go, Isabel stumbled slightly, wincing as Rick's hand tightened on her waist. The laundry basket tilted, and a child's sock fell to the ground. Maggie watched as Isabel bent to retrieve it, her sleeve riding up to reveal a ring of bruises around her wrist, like a bracelet of dark shadows. Their eyes met for a brief moment as Isabel straightened, and Maggie saw something there that made her heart ache, a plea, unspoken but unmistakable. Then they were gone, the door closing firmly behind them, leaving Maggie alone with her roses and a decision weighing on her conscience. That afternoon, she called her late husband's former partner on the police force, Detective James Collins. They'd stayed in touch over the years, James checking in on her regularly, bringing his family over for holidays. "I'm not sure if it's anything," she said, after explaining her observations, "but those little girls seem afraid. And their mother. I had bruises, James." "Has the mother said anything directly?" he asked, his voice carrying the professional detachment he'd perfected over decades. "No, she barely gets a chance to speak when he's around." James sighed, a sound heavy with familiar frustration. "Without a complaint from her or visible signs of abuse on the children, there's not much we can do officially. We could send someone for a welfare check, but if this guy is as controlling as you say, that might make things worse." "So I'm supposed to do nothing?" Maggie's voice rose slightly. "Wait until one of them ends up in the hospital or worse?" "I didn't say that," James replied carefully. "Document what you see and hear, dates, times, specific observations. See if you can establish contact with the mother alone. If she wants help, we can connect her with resources." After hanging up, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, a pad of paper before her. She began to write, meticulously recording everything she'd seen and heard since the family moved in. The twins' statement, the sounds in the night, the bruises on Isabel's wrist. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next week, Maggie created opportunities to observe the family. She took more frequent walks past their house, timed her gardening to coincide with their comings and goings, and even baked extra cookies as an excuse to knock on their door. Rick always intercepted these attempts at connection, his charm firmly in place for the outside world. But Maggie was a patient woman. She'd been a teacher for 35 years before retiring. She knew how to wait for the right moment. It came sooner than expected on a Tuesday morning when Rick's truck was nowhere to be seen. Maggie, taking out her recycling, spotted Isabel in her front yard, half-heartedly raking leaves while the twins played nearby. "Beautiful day," Maggie called, walking over with a casual wave. "Could use a hand with those leaves?" Isabel glanced down the street, then nodded with a hesitant smile. "That would be nice. Rick's at a job interview. He won't be back until afternoon." They worked side by side for a while, Maggie careful to keep the conversation light. The twins gradually moved closer, curious about this neighbor who smiled so readily. "Your roses are pretty, Sophia at..." Least Maggie thought it was Sophia, said shyly. "Thank you, sweetie. Would you like to help me deadhead some tomorrow? That means cutting off the old blooms so new ones can grow." Both girls looked to their mother, eyes hopeful. Isabel hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe for a little while, if it's a good day." Maggie understood the qualification without needing explanation. "Of course, whenever works for you all." As they finished the raking, Maggie gathered her courage. "Isabel, I hope you don't mind my asking, but is everything okay at home?" Isabel froze, rake in mid-motion. "What do you mean?" "I've noticed some things," Maggie said gently. "The girls seem frightened sometimes. And the other day, I saw bruises. On your wrist." Isabel's face closed like a shuttered window. "I'm clumsy, always have been." "Mom fell down the stairs," Camilla offered, her young face serious. "Rick said she has to be more careful." "We don't have stairs," Sophia whispered, and then looked alarmed at her own words. Isabel's eyes filled with tears. She knelt before her daughters, pulling them close. "It's okay, Miss Angelis, everything's fine." But Maggie could see it wasn't fine, not by a long shot. "Isabel," she said quietly, "if you ever need help, any kind of help, my door is always open day or night." Something shifted in Isabel's expression, a crack in the facade of normalcy she'd been desperately maintaining. "He wasn't always like this," she whispered, so low Maggie almost missed it. "When we first met, he was kind, said he'd take care of us after my husband died. But now..." A car engine rumbled in the distance, and Isabel stiffened. "You should go," she said urgently. "Please." Maggie nodded, understanding. "Remember what I said. Any time." She returned to her home, heart racing, and immediately added this new information to her growing documentation. That night, she placed a small battery-powered lamp in her kitchen window facing the neighbor's house, a silent signal that her offer stood. 3 days later, when she heard the first sounds of a more serious altercation from next door, Maggie didn't hesitate. She dialed 911, described what she was hearing, and mentioned her previous concerns about the family. "Officers are on their way," the dispatcher assured her. Maggie watched from her window as 2 police cruisers arrived, lights flashing but sirens silent. The officers approached the house cautiously, and for several long minutes Maggie could see nothing more than shadows moving behind closed blinds. Then the front door opened. Rick emerged first, his body language radiating controlled fury despite the smile he forced for the officers. Isabel followed, the twins clinging to her legs. Even from a distance, Maggie could see the redness around Isabel's throat, like the beginning of a handprint. One officer separated Isabel and the children from Rick, speaking to them privately while his partner kept Rick occupied. Maggie saw Isabel shake her head repeatedly, her posture defensive, protective arms around her daughters. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers left. No one was arrested. The family went back inside, and the night fell quiet once more. Maggie felt sick with disappointment and worry. She'd hoped the police intervention would be a turning point, but it seemed Isabel wasn't ready, or didn't feel safe enough to speak out. Shortly after midnight, a soft knock at her back door jolted Maggie from an uneasy sleep in her recliner. She approached cautiously, turning on the porch light to reveal Isabel with a twin on each hip, their small faces streaked with tears. "Can we come in?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Just for tonight, please. Maggie flung the door wide, ushering them inside. Of course, come in, come in. As she closed and locked the door behind them, Maggie noticed that Isabel carried nothing but her daughters and the clothes on their backs. The decision to flee had been sudden then, perhaps triggered by something after the police left. He was so angry after they were gone, Isabel confirmed, as Maggie made up the guest room with fresh sheets. The twins were already asleep on the couch, exhausted from fear and tears. He said I'd called them, that I was trying to take his family away. When he started drinking, she shuddered. I waited until he passed out. You did the right thing, Maggie assured her, setting down a stack of towels. You're safe here. Isabel looked at her with eyes too old for her young face. For tonight, maybe, but he'll look for us, and when he finds us, we'll deal with tomorrow when it comes, Maggie said firmly. For now, get some rest. Later, as Maggie watched over the sleeping family, she made a series of calls. To James, to a women's shelter she'd researched, to a lawyer friend who specialized in restraining orders. By morning, she had the beginnings of a plan. What she didn't have was Isabel's agreement to it. I can't, Isabel said, when Maggie laid out the options over coffee, while the twins explored the backyard garden with wide-eyed wonder. He'll say, I kidnapped the girls. He's not their real father, but we're married now, and he's been so careful to establish himself as their guardian. He knows the right people, says the right things. There are resources, Isabel, people who can help. You don't understand. Isabel's hands trembled around her mug. My visa depends on our marriage. If I leave him, I could be deported. The girls were born here, they're citizens. I could lose them. Maggie reached across the table, covering Isabel's cold hands with her warm ones. Then we'll find another way. This isn't just about you anymore, or even just about the girls. It's about breaking a cycle before it destroys all of you. Isabel looked out the window at her daughters, who were carefully examining a butterfly that had landed on one of Maggie's prized roses. For the first time since Maggie had met her, a genuine smile touched her lips. They used to laugh all the time, she said softly. Before Rick, their father, my first husband, he would play with them for hours. After he died, they stopped laughing for months. Her smile faded. Then they started again when they met Rick. He was good with them, at first, until he wasn't. Maggie waited, sensing there was more. Last night, when Camilla spilled her juice, he grabbed her arm so hard, Isabel's voice broke. There are bruises shaped like his fingers. That's when I knew we had to leave, no matter what. May I see? Maggie asked gently. Isabel nodded, calling the girls inside. With tender care, she rolled up Camilla's sleeve to reveal 5 perfect fingerprints darkening her small arm. Sophia has them too, Isabel said quietly. He said they needed to learn to be more careful. Something hardened in Maggie's heart, a resolve that had been building since she first heard the twins crying in her garden. This changes things, she said. James, my friend on the police force, can get Child Protective Services involved immediately with evidence of physical abuse. On the children. Fear flashed across Isabel's face. They'll take my girls. Not if we do this right, Maggie assured her. Not if you're clearly protecting them from harm. They were in the middle of making a plan when Rick's truck screeched to a halt in front of Maggie's house. The twins, who had been cautiously beginning to relax, immediately tensed, their identical faces draining of color. It's okay, Maggie said, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. Stay in the kitchen. I'll handle this. Isabel gathered her daughters close. Be careful. He has a temper. That, Maggie thought grimly as she made her way to the front door, was an understatement. Through the frosted glass, she could see Rick's tall figure marching up her front walk, his body language radiating fury. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by pounding. I know they're in there, Rick shouted. Isabel, get out here now! Maggie took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door just enough to face him without allowing him a view into her home. Good morning, Rick, she said with forced pleasantness. Is there something I can help you with? His face was flushed with anger, and she suspected the remnants of last night's drinking. "Don't play games with me, old woman. My wife and kids are here. I want them now." "I'm afraid I don't appreciate your tone," Maggie replied, keeping her voice steady. "And I certainly don't appreciate being called old woman on my own doorstep." Rick's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Listen carefully. Isabel and the girls are my family. Whatever she's told you is a lie. She's not well, has these episodes where she makes things up, gets paranoid." "Is that so?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. "And the bruises on the girls' arms, are those made up too?" Something shifted in Rick's expression, a momentary falter before the mask of concerned husband slid back into place. "Kids get bruises all the time? They're active, they play rough. Isabel overreacts because of her condition." "What condition would that be?" "That's private family business." Rick stepped closer, using his height to intimidate. "Now I'm asking so nicely. Let me speak to my wife." Behind Maggie, a small voice rang out. "She's not coming with you." Maggie turned to see Sophia standing in the hallway, her small face set with determination. Despite her trembling lower lip, Rick's fake smile vanished. "Go get your mother and sister, Sophia. We're going home." "No." The little girl's voice was stronger now. "You hurt Mommy. You hurt Camilla. You hurt me." "That's enough." Rick lunged forward, trying to push past Maggie to reach the child. Maggie stood her ground, shockingly strong for her age. "You will not enter my home," she said, her teacher's voice cutting through his rage. "And you will not touch that child." For a moment, they were at an impasse, Rick's larger frame blocked by Maggie's unwavering stance and the legal boundary of her threshold. Then several things happened at once. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, James stepping out with another officer. Isabel appeared behind Sophia, Camilla in her arms, both of their sleeves rolled up to reveal the damning evidence of Rick's discipline. And from the house across, the street, a neighbor emerged with a phone held high, clearly recording the entire confrontation. Rick's face contorted with rage as he realized he was cornered. "This isn't over," he snarled at Maggie. Then, in a desperate move, he grabbed for Sophia. Maggie reacted without thinking, pushing the child behind her with one hand while the other, still holding her garden shears from earlier, came up defensively. "Step." "They're away from the door, sir," James called, approaching with his hand on his holstered weapon. "Now." For a breathless moment, Maggie thought Rick might actually attack despite the witnesses. The hatred in his eyes burned so hot she could almost feel it on her skin. But self-preservation won out. Rick backed away slowly, hands raised in mock surrender. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice suddenly calm and reasonable for the officer's benefit. "My wife and children stayed with our neighbor last night after a family disagreement. I just came to take them home." "Is that right, Ma'am?" The younger officer asked Isabel, who had moved to the doorway, a protective arm around each twin. Isabel looked at Rick, then at her daughter's bruised arms, then at Maggie, who nodded encouragingly. Drawing herself up to her full height, she said clearly, "No, that's not right. My daughters and I left because we were afraid for our safety." She held out Camilla's arm. "This is why." The officer's expression hardened as he took in the obvious handprint. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over to the car with me." As James led Rick away, the man twisted to look back at Isabel, his expression a chilling mixture of rage and promise. "You'll regret this," he called. "All of you." The threat hung in the air, causing the twins to press closer to their mother. But Isabel stood firm, watching as Rick was placed in the back of the police cruiser. "He's right about one thing," she said quietly to Maggie. "This isn't over." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, temporary restraining, orders and difficult decisions. Maggie opened her home to Isabel and the twins, while they navigated the complex process of breaking free from Rick's control. Child Protective Services became involved due to the documented abuse of the twins, but contrary to Isabel's fears, they worked to keep the family together while ensuring their safety. Rick was charged with child abuse and domestic violence, but released on bail with orders to stay away from Isabel and the children. "He won't give up easily," Isabel confided. One evening as they sat on Maggie's porch, watching the twins carefully water the rose bushes Maggie was teaching them to tend. "He believes we belong to him." "You belong to yourselves," Maggie replied firmly, "and you're stronger than you think." Slowly, Isabel began to believe it. With Maggie's encouragement, she connected with a domestic violence support group and a pro bono lawyer who specialized in helping immigrant women in abusive marriages. She discovered that, contrary to Rick's threats, there were pathways to maintain her legal status without staying in the marriage, especially given the documented abuse. The twins, too, began to heal. Their nightmares gradually became less frequent, and their natural exuberance returned in fits and starts. They took special pride in helping Maggie in her garden, learning the names of different roses and watching with wonder as buds unfurled into blooms under their care. "Plants are like people," Maggie told them as they worked side by side one crisp autumn afternoon, weeks after they'd first appeared in her garden. "They need the right conditions to thrive: good soil, water, sunlight." "What do people need?" Camilla asked, carefully patting soil around a new cutting. Maggie smiled at the child's thoughtful face. "Safety, love, patience, and sometimes a little help from others when the growing gets tough." Sophia nodded seriously. "Like you helped us." "Like we helped each other," Maggie corrected gently. "Your mama was very brave to leave, and you girls were brave to tell the truth about what happened." The final confrontation came as they'd all feared it might, despite the restraining order. Rick showed up at Maggie's house late one night, clearly intoxicated and determined to reclaim his family. This time, however, they were prepared. The security system James had insisted Maggie install alerted them to Rick's presence before he even reached the door. While Isabel hustled the twins to the safe room they'd prepared, Maggie calmly called the police. "They're my family," Rick shouted through the door. "You've poisoned them against me, you interfering old witch." "The police are on their way, Rick," Maggie called back, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You're violating your restraining order." His response was to slam his body against the door, the wood creaking ominously. "I'll show Isabel what happens when she disobeys me." The door shuddered again under his weight, and Maggie backed away, heading for the safe room where Isabel and the girls waited. Before she reached it, however, there was a new sound. Police sirens, followed by the commanding voice of James through a bullhorn. "Richard Dawson." "This is the police. Step away from the house with your hands visible." What followed was a brief but intense standoff, with Rick alternating between threats and attempts to justify his actions. In the end, though, he was taken into custody, this time without bail due to the violation of his previous conditions of release. The night Rick was arrested for the final time, Maggie sat with Isabel long after the twins had fallen asleep. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. Isabel looked around the room that had become a sanctuary for her family, then out at the garden where her daughters had begun to laugh again. "Heal," she said simply. "Learn to trust myself again. Be the mother they deserve." "You already are," Maggie assured her. Isabel smiled, the expression no longer strange on her face. "We can't stay here forever, though. You've done so much already." "Stay as long as you need," Maggie interrupted. "This old house has been too quiet for too long." It was true. Since her husband's death, Maggie had lived a solitary life, her days measured in small routines and memories. Now her home was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, with Isabel's soft humming as she cooked dinner, with the shared comfort of new friendships forged in crisis. In the months that followed, as winter gave way to spring, they established a new normal. Isabel found work as a teacher's aide at the local elementary school, her natural warmth and patience perfect for the role. The twins enrolled in first grade, where they thrived under the stability of their new life. Maggie, who had always kept to herself since her husband died, found herself becoming part of a community again, not just with Isabel and the twins, but with the wider network of supporters who had rallied around them. On a warm Saturday in May, as they celebrated the twins' 7th birthday in the backyard, surrounded by new friends from school and the neighborhood, Maggie watched Isabel laugh at something one of the other mothers said. Gone was the frightened woman who had knocked on her door in the middle of the night. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. The twins raced over, faces sticky with cake. "Maggie, come. See what Sophia can do," Camilla exclaimed, tugging at her hand. As she allowed herself to be led across the yard, Maggie reflected on the strange turns life could take. She had always thought of her roses as her legacy, the beautiful things she would leave behind when she was gone. Now she realized that her true legacy might be this: the family she had helped save, the lives that would flourish because she had been brave enough to act when it mattered most. Sophia demonstrated her newly mastered cartwheel, then both twins insisted Maggie join their game of tag. As she playfully chased them around the garden, their laughter rising like music into the clear spring air, Maggie knew that while the road ahead might not always be smooth, healing rarely was, they would travel it together. And in the end, that made all the difference.